free to post your questions there in the chat box below. So starting off with Hillary Brown is joining us from New York. She's professor of architecture at the Spitzer School at the City College of New York. And she's a program director of the school's interdisciplinary sustainability in the urban environment master's program. And she's also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. She's the author of Next Generation Infrastructure, Principles of Post-Industrial Public Works, and she served on the Board of Infrastructure and the Constructed Environment for the National Research Council, as well as the Board of Directors for the U.S. Green Building Council. And previously, Hillary was Assistant Commissioner at City of New York, where she was the founding director of the Office of Sustainable Design, and where she led the publication of the nationally recognized City of New York High Performance Building Guidelines. And Hillary is a fellow of Post Carbon Institute. So welcome, Hillary. Let's give you 5 minutes, and then just to kind of introduce what your work is, what your background is, and kind of your initial thoughts on infrastructure in the 100% renewable world, and then we'll see how long we can keep you on.
Great, thank you so much, and this is wonderful to join you all. I would just like to say that since my background is in architecture, not engineering, I've still tried to apply some of the concepts behind ecological thinking and ecological design to the systems that enable us to run our cities. And so the book that I will talk a little bit about ideas from that book really do talk about some strategies that we can actually begin to apply to look at our energy waste sanitation systems, even energy waste, water, and sanitation, and not focused as much on transport. But I think that one of the things that the book gets across is that we needed a new paradigm for how we think about our public works. We need to move away from the conventional ideas under the industrial paradigm where all of these systems are single purpose and segregated, and try to think of them more ecologically. In other words, how do we avoid the vulnerabilities and gain some of the opportunities for efficiency, i.e. reduce carbon, by looking at them in the aggregate and how they may be interconnected. So when you think about the general issue of interdependency, we need power to treat and pump water and treat it, and we need water for power plant cooling. So these are interconnected ideas, but there are also opportunities to take waste, exchange waste from one system to power another. And that's what the book does in a kind of case study approach. And just to give you a few ideas about this, I'm going to talk about how we can use these, what we call infrastructural ecologies, to optimize the performance of our various utilities collectively. So in Denmark, in Sweden, in the city of Hammarby Sjöstad, the city fathers worked with all municipal utilities to cycle waste from one to another. And so, for example, they cycle waste heat from the wastewater treatment plant to district heating. Methane from that same plant goes to power vehicles as biogas, as well as cook stoves. Compost returns to the forest, where the wood chips are used for combined heating and power, and so on and so forth. So on top of all this, then they utilize solar and wind energy. But it is those combined exchanges actually that help reduce their CO2. So, I might give a few more examples if I have time to do that, of really innovative examples from across the world. For example, the mayor of Lille, France, looked across 3 municipal services to create emissions reduction solutions through renewables. He recovers methane from and the sewer gas from the wastewater treatment plant and treats that and compresses it to fuel the public fleet. Then he went further to create an organic waste recycling plant to add to that fuel source. And so they have reduced their CO2 emissions by a major factor. Another example, I think I would call out, a smaller, more community-oriented example, is where the campus of the University of New Hampshire is meeting its CO2 goals, reduction goals, through treating methane that is piped in and treated at the campus of a nearby landfill, and using that to generate predominant heating and power for the campus. Maybe I'll throw in one more, which I think is really a good one because it shows how we can start to piggyback these things. The city of Vancouver, British Columbia, is providing district heating and cooling by recovering the waste heat from building wastewater. And that is then being transmitted to heat pumps in buildings to provide cooling and heating, with a 60% reduction in greenhouse gases. So those are just a few examples. I could go to more, but I think the other thing I would say is it's not just in our power generation, but in terms of our water treatment, we can use really more passive systems to replace high chemical intensive and energy intensive treatment of water. Just one quick example, the city of Arcata, California, you probably already know, converted some brownfields on the coast to treatment ponds, constructed wetlands, and polishing wetlands that have enabled them to avoid spending quite a hefty chunk to co-fund a wastewater treatment plant. So what I'm trying to put forward is this notion for not only for our centralized systems, but also these same principles can be utilized at a more local level, at a district level, at a neighborhood level, if we're to create distributed systems, combined water, energy, waste, water treatment, so that we can create some redundancy to the grid, as well as supplement the grid as needed, as needs grow. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Daniel, and I'll take questions later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. Yeah, I'm going to have some follow-up questions for you to push this beyond efficiency. We want to get into the radical, far-reaching stuff. That's where it gets really interesting and challenging. So we'll move on next to Alicia. Alicia Daniels Uhlig is joining us from Seattle. She's the director of the Living Community Challenge and Policy Program at the International Living Future Institute. That program helps planners and developers rethink how they design their community-scale projects and provides a compliance review process at the master planning stage and certification for fully built community or campus-scale projects. Previously, she was principal and director of sustainability at the multidisciplinary design firm GGLO, where she was involved with the Capitol Hill Eco District and Seattle's Climate Action Plan and Climate Resilient Plan. Alicia is a lifetime member of the American Solar Energy Society. She serves on the U.S. Green Building Council's Lead Advisory Committee and is a 10-year member of the Cascadia Green Building Council's Seattle Branch Steering Committee. And she tweets at Alicia Daniels U. So, Alicia, I'll hand it over to you for about 7 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. So as you mentioned, here at the International Living Future Institute, I am the director of the Living Community Challenge and Policy. We're best known probably for the Living Building Challenge, which is a philosophy, an advocacy tool, and a certification system that you might be familiar with. Our offices are actually here at the Bullitt Center, the world's largest living building that is certified to the living building standard. But I really welcome this opportunity to talk about the Living Community Challenge, which is one of our newer programs. And it was launched in May 2014. So if the Living Building Challenge imagines buildings using the metaphor of a flower, the Living Community Challenge isn't just a bunch of flowers. It really imagines communities using the metaphor of a forest. How our neighborhoods and our communities can be connected to nature, harvest all of their own energy, water, and food, similar to a forest, use waste as a resource. They are diverse, healthy, and of course, our communities need to be beautiful like forests. When people are connected to their place, when places are beautiful, when they are attached to them, they will steward them over time. And I think some of the concepts that you've been talking about in your book about this radical change to renewable power really is going to need people to be active in their communities and steward their places over time. So the Living Community Challenge, it's one part philosophy. We really are rooted in this idea that every place can be socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. And in order to do so, we need to change the way we design, construct, and operate our buildings, our infrastructure, our communities. And that's going to take, one part advocacy. There are many different challenges and barriers in the way we are currently siloed in how we design, permit our communities. And I'd love to talk more about that with you today. And then, of course, we're rooted in this idea of it is a certification program that many people know about. So you mentioned the master plan compliance pathway, which is helping a variety of communities. But there's also, when we talk about the community scale, there's a visioning process. So we find that a variety of different communities are using the Living Community Challenge standard in a variety of different ways. One of those ways might be for existing communities that are dealing with restorative, regenerative, and resiliency issues that are pretty complex in existing neighborhood. They might be using the Living Community Challenge as a way to coalesce a common vision. And we actually, through the release of our new handbook, which you can find on our webpage, have this idea of a visioning plan process to really help communities work in more systems thinking, community design, and what's that first step to building a living community. That may be for an infill urban master plan type development. We do have that master plan compliance that you were talking about. And that's really this one part vision and other part implementation, which gets to very specific requirements of how that community intends to meet the Living Community Challenge. So if we work on this metaphor of a forest, the basic system of the Living Community Challenge is broken into 7 categories or performance areas, and those are place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity, and beauty. It's based on a system of 20 imperatives that are mandatory. It's not a la carte. And one important distinction of our standard is that it's based on performance. So these communities need to be occupied for 12 months. We gather things like utility bills, not energy models. Obviously, you need an energy model if you're going to be targeting high performance, net positive energy within these communities. But we think performance is a very important piece of achieving the type of restorative communities that we really want. I think another important aspect of our program is that we are an international program, and we have 672 ambassadors in, I believe it's 43 countries, and 86 collaboratives within various cities in which people can get involved from all aspects of the built environment. So our network is really based on people who are interested. It's the intersection of the built environment and innovation. So developers, designers of all kinds, engineers, architects, product manufacturers. And I think that's important as we talk about this advanced net positive restorative type of future that we are all envisioning as we move to renewables, that is going to take every discipline within the built environment to work collaboratively towards a living future.
Thanks, Alicia. So now we'll move on to Warren, and I'll have a lot of questions for you afterwards to see how much time we have. Now we'll move on to Warren. Warren Karlenzig, he's joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area. He is president of the firm Common Current, where he consults on catalyzing sustainable, smart, and resilient city development policy for clients ranging from the state of California to the Guangzhou China Planning Agency to the United Nations and the World Bank. Some months ago, he was in Paris for the COP21 climate talks, where he presented at Autodesk's new whole building analysis product at a symposium that was organized by Ed Masria and Architecture 2030. And he may be recognizable to many in our audience as the author of How Green is Your City? The Sustainlane U.S. City Rankings, which back in 2007 was an early and influential book that popularized holistic city sustainability metrics. And Warren is, like Hillary, also a fellow of Post Carbon Institute, and he tweets at twitter.com/greenflow. So Warren, off to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Hillary and Alicia, for your wonderful presentations and work. So Common Current is a consultancy that works with the public, private, philanthropic, and NGO sectors in planning sustainable and resilient structure for cities. And a little background besides work in Asia and Europe and the US. This is the 20th anniversary of my writing the original language for what became San Francisco's Municipal Green Building Ordinance. And that was one of the first in the world, pre-lead. And I also worked on the Net Zero Packard Foundation headquarters, which the Living Futures Institute did the certification on. So those are a few tangible projects. I've also done a lot of authoring United Nations work on the Shanghai Manual, which is sort of a playbook the UN put out across a number of agencies for sustainable and resilient cities. And most recently, I've been collaborating with the private sector, including technology and engineering firms, on smart, resilient city planning, 3D visualization and analytics of large-scale blue-green infrastructure, renewables, and energy efficiency, and also mobility. So that's kind of a mouthful, but really the areas I'm interested in are how can urban energy, mobility, and water systems complement one another in progression toward 100% renewables, including through smart systems. And Hillary did touch on some of that, the overlap between some of those areas, which is referred to often now as a circular economy, but that also goes back to industrial ecology and regional and industrial metabolism, those areas I worked on way back during the Clinton administration. I'm very interested in what is being overlooked with 100% renewable energy targets. And often the things are underestimated or even ignored in our quest for 100% renewables is regard society, health, education, other institutional capacities, not just government, but there are many sectors, and we heard about some of those sectors from Alicia and Hillary. But so in economics, what new economic models will we have to examine? Full cost accounting obviously is one, but down in the particular practices, how will those need to be changed with new tools? A lot of that comes down to information technology or digitization or big data as the input, but what we do with a lot of that data and information remains to be seen. And then how can we achieve whole system strategies through all these issues that I've touched upon? And one project that I've been working on in the past year and a half or so has been with Los Angeles, and it illustrates some of these issues. The city is trying to implement green infrastructure on a large scale. So I've been working through Autodesk and engineering company CH2M Hill with the LA Department of Water and Power on 3D visualization of green infrastructure. Now, this green infrastructure is going to capture rainwater and be able to put it back in the aquifer to Los Angeles. The city now gets some of its water from the aquifer, and they want to stop importing so much water. They have a goal to increase their local water by about triple in about 20 years. So they're going to need to rely on local water. That impacts energy greatly because in California, for instance, about 19% of the state's energy is used for moving water or treating water. So therefore, if you could reduce the amount that water's moved, which now is, anywhere from hundreds to almost 500 miles to get to Los Angeles by capturing its rainwater, then you are reducing energy consumption in a big way. So I'm very curious about how institutions are really looking at modeling the multiple institutional impacts that such endeavors will bring. Also, the LA River and bringing open space and also aquifer water capture and improving real estate value, but social just for the the low-income people that live near these infrastructural amenities. And so, we're going to get into a lot of issues with desalination and drought. One issue now with climate change is resilience, and it's really being touched on almost separate from climate change, particularly by the politicians. For instance, the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton have a platform on climate change mitigation, but they have virtually no platform or plank on resilience. So, we're going to need to cool our cities. We're going to need to bring down urban heat island impacts. We're going to need to address drought and the energy water nexus. We're going to need to address food and food security, as well as all the defense and other industry implications those things have. Some agencies are starting to change in their approach, and some cities are changing. For instance, LA Metro is now planning green infrastructure along with its transit planning. And so that will address water and social equity and recreation and urban heat island impact. And we need more of that sort of whole system type approach with our public agencies, but also in the private sector and the employment information technology. And one final little case study is the Oakland Eco Block. It's a project across Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and many other federal agencies, as well as the city of Oakland, to take one residential block and to combine renewable energy with the residents and that store energy, not even using batteries. They're using physical storage means like flywheels, and also looking at water and collective systems for being more efficient on a single city block scale, which that group has determined can be about 50% of urban systems in the way that our cities have been laid out, and really come up with whole new models of efficiency and social justice and collaboration around these important assets. And all this will have to really supplement our thinking about, you just don't snap on solar panels and hook up to a wind turbine and solve the problems we're dealing with. I look forward to all the questions from the audience and from Daniel as well. And it's been a pleasure working with the Post-Carbon Institute.
Great, thank you, Warren. All right, lots of interesting stuff here, and I realize I should probably say a little bit about myself so you all know where I'm coming from. I am the publications director here at Post-Carbon, so I'm responsible for better or worse for the quality of all our print publications. But my background and passion really is in urban sustainability. I wrote a book in 2007 called Post-Carbon Cities, Planning for Energy and Climate Uncertainty, and I was also the founding chair of the Sustainable Communities Division at the American Planning Association about 6 years ago, back when even the architects were talking about urban sustainability, but the planners were still kind of lagging on that. So a group of us tried to fix that. So there are a lot of things I want to get into here, but mindful of Hillary's battery capacity, I want to start with her with a question. And again, I want to reiterate that I think I think you're all in the audience are probably seeing that, partly why we were so excited to bring Alicia and Hillary and Warren together is that all three of them are longtime leaders in these issues, and I would not hesitate to say visionaries. There are a lot of people now talking about efficiency and green buildings and green infrastructure and even ecological design and eco-industrial parks, stuff that was just way out of left field, 10, 15 years ago. It's a lot more common now, and Warren and Hillary and Alicia they're some of the people that are really pushing things forward and beyond that. So I really, in this webinar, I really want to get into some of those more challenging topics that don't often get discussed. We know how to make a lot of our systems more efficient. We know how to run some things on electricity, preferably renewably generated electricity. But what are the next steps? What are the next big challenges? So Hillary, infrastructure is probably one of the biggest challenges, and there's largely because there's such enormous quantities of energy involved, and even to do things like construct public works, you can't really do that on electricity so much. So I'd love if you could get into maybe some examples of like the most interesting and far-reaching ideas that you've seen in making infrastructure work in a 100% renewable world. And particularly if you have examples from adapting, retrofitting, or new construction infrastructure that we can draw from the experience of big cities like New York City, where you're based.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to just choose a few from around the country that some of which are still in process. But I think the ramping up and the uptake of solar and wind is happening. But we all know that because of the indeterminacy and the intermittency, that we need storage, and we need work on the grid, we need work on storage, and those are things that I think we need to be as co-creative about as possible. Just a couple of examples for how we can ramp up the storage that we will need in order to meet our energy demands. As one example, there is a abandoned coal mine in Arizona that is under consideration for use as a hydro pump storage system. So the land around that abandoned copper mine will house a solar farm. But during the day, when that power is being generated, it will pump water from the base of the pit to a reservoir on top. And so it can, on demand, release that water and discharge onto the grid to levelize the demand. So that's just one example of how we're using sound systems. There are instances, particularly in the Midwest, where we can use salt caverns that have been emptied and use those for compressed air storage. Again, the idea is to pump air under pressure into these caverns using available wind power and discharge it when we need it on the grid. So those are just two examples, I think, of extremely creative instances. Maybe I'll throw in a third, because there are 1 million coal mines in the world that are, many of which are abandoned and usable. And one town in the Netherlands is using under the abandoned mine, the water that fills the abandoned mines, in different levels as heat sources or heat sinks to provide heat for district heating and cooling as well. So these are ways that we can look to our environment, look to local phenomenon as renewable sources. We can use, the capacity of the earth. Of course, we could talk about geothermal and what's going on in Denmark and Iceland in particular. Iceland is probably most advanced in terms of its using the geothermal heat from the earth for generating power. So I'll stop there and perhaps let you throw some more questions around.
Okay. And actually, there was a really good question that just came up in the chat box that I think is very relevant to infrastructure. So I want to, again, pose that to you while we still have you with your battery. Paul Herman said, any comments on electrification of highways for freight trucking? And maybe not so much specifically to highways, but I think this question of how do we take this nationwide transportation infrastructure, worth probably trillions of dollars, all oriented on moving very large, very heavy vehicles, many of which are, owned by single family, owned by households, all running on liquid fuels with their a nationwide network of service stations, massive infrastructure. From a public works perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, how do we begin to think about transitioning that to a world where we are largely relying on 100% renewable energy? I'll say there's some examples like, Tesla's trying to go one model, and there's other models like maybe running, electric corridors for traction wire pulling trucks or whatnot. But how do you, as an infrastructure expert, how do you begin to think through that sort of challenge at these scales?
Well, I won't respond directly to the next generation transport system itself, but let me just say that we dedicate so much real estate to these highways for single purpose use. So, we are starting to see some highly utilized corridors which are being retrofit to accommodate light rail or monorail. But one of the ways that Europe is thinking about this, that we could definitely build upon, is they use the highways, particularly as the highways cut through cities and neighborhoods. They co-locate solar panels on the noise reduction panels. So it's a kind of 2-for-1 use. And Europe has really done some studies to say, if they utilized all of the east-west highways, and of course we have a huge east-west highway system, so the north face of those highway systems, of course, could be tremendously useful as power generation. But Europe did the calculation to say that, it could, if it were to retrofit rail lines and highways, as it's starting to do, to combine these noise reduction with devices with solar power, they could probably run 6% of that would generate as much as 6% of their energy demand. Have we lost?
You just paused on mine. I think we. Okay, and we should move on because we don't have a whole lot of time left. And also, since we started late, I'd like to maybe 5 minutes late to 1:35 Pacific time presenters. That would be great. No worries if you can't do that.
Sure. I'd like to add to that transportation question as well.
Yes.
Within the Living Challenge, as well as the Living Community Challenge, I think it's essential what each of the speakers have touched on is the systems thinking approach. You can't touch energy or transportation without thinking about water and equity, and materials are a piece of that as well. So with the challenge, for example, we have the living economy sourcing, which really states that in order to support regional economies and reduce transportation emissions as well, really looking and sourcing your materials closer to the actual site. So when you pair this with the transportation technologies and the efficiency, I think it's not one or the other, but you're going to need all of these strategies and really make some movement on each one of those to get the kind of change we need for the transportation freight industry as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, there we go. Thanks for that addition. So Alicia, I've got I do have. Oh, by the way, I keep forgetting to mention. You all probably noticed that each of our presenters here has a thorough backing in ecological design and the principles of systems thinking. So that's also the style of thinking that at least we at Post Carbon think is important for dealing with some of these challenges. So Alicia, kind of my specific question for you, kind of in the same way that I asked Hillary to reflect on big lessons that we can draw from. I was curious, what do you feel is the biggest lesson that we can draw from all the changes we've been seeing in the architecture profession and the development practices over the last 20 years, as you've been a practicing architect for a long time, in one of the most forward-thinking communities there in Seattle. So, we've gone from the days of Andres Plater-Zyberk and New Urbanism through LEED, and now in eco-districts and Living Future now. Where is that going? How do you see the profession changing, and where do you think it needs to go, and beyond the obvious direction of what you're proposing at Living Future?
Right. Well, I think where we need to go is higher performing communities and buildings and infrastructure to a really restorative type of development. And I think I'm really encouraged seeing the development over the design and construction industry over the years that it is possible. Dennis Hayes of the Bullitt Foundation, founder of Earth Day, developed the Bullitt Center here, likes to say this building is living proof. I think individually, many of these systems find their way into individual buildings. It is very rare to find a living building of this scale that has put all the pieces together. It is net positive energy. It is creating more energy than it uses. It treats all of its own waste. The materials are sourced locally and are non-toxic. And putting all those pieces together, just in my short time here at the Institute, joining this year, I've seen groups already from around the world who are coming to visit this living proof and be inspired by it, take that story back to their own community and want to implement it. So it's interesting that you mentioned a variety of other standards and certification systems that I've used as well in my career. And I think where we really are in the industry is that we're moving from this mentality of less bad and less harm to truly net positive, or what we would even say hand printing. Your handprint is larger than your footprint, towards this idea of a restorative future. And so as you see these catalytic projects, living buildings that hopefully create some sort of momentum to generate living communities, the newer program launched in 2014, I think people really think this philosophy around this end game, this really audacious goal of restorative communities, it is possible, and we can design that way, we construct that way, and we can definitely operate our communities and our buildings as such. So I'm very hopeful to see a lot more change and a lot faster. I think we've hit a sweet spot in the momentum, and I'm very hopeful that it'll keep going exponentially.
Great. And then a very quick follow-up on that, again, kind of drawing from my own experience with the American Planning Association. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how maybe, obviously the profession is changing, but maybe for people in our audience who are practicing architects or practicing planners, or even people working in the design field in some other ways, what are ways that they can get involved in really pushing the profession to, I guess my own personal opinion would be, it needs to change faster, it needs to be shifting from more these continuing mainstream and conventional practices to these more restorative and ecological design informed practices. What are the ways of doing that beyond just kind of like allowing for the natural evolution that seems to take so long?
Right. So a shameless plug here. We couldn't exist without our volunteers. It's something I feel passionate about. Obviously, I was a volunteer for the Institute for 10 years before I joined, but we have an ambassador program. So you can go to living-future.org /ambassador and find out how you can become an ambassador and spread the word about the Living Building Challenge, the Living Community Challenge, our programs like declare around material ingredient disclosure, just around social equity and being very transparent about that. You can implement that in your firm. You can take pieces of it. You know, a whole building doesn't, we want it to be a living building for that restorative future. It doesn't have to be. You can start out with, take it to your leadership in your design firm or your real estate firm and say, every project of ours should have products in it. At least one should have a declare label, which is transparent about the ingredients, and it should be, you know, red list free and you know, a more healthy material to use in a building product. So you can take small steps and then at the same time push the boundary, be an ambassador, tell people about various projects. We have 340 registered, over 340 registered projects between our programs, and 44 certified. And we have, you know, a decade worth of experience there that these have been out. And so that's a lot of change in a relatively short period of time. And you can spread that word and get people inspired for change.
Excellent. Thank you, Alicia. So Warren, I kind of saved you for last because I've got some of a lot of bringing some of these questions and some of these ideas together with you, particularly because you've worked in so many different areas and both thematically and geographically. You may have seen there in the chat transcript, we've had a couple questions already about these questions of technology. Someone mentioned, you know, how do we, when we have proven technologies that would be very appropriate for the new renewable world, like bus rapid transit and whatnot, and yet a lot of people, especially in government, seem to get very excited about the next new thing. And the question was kind of getting at, you know, how do we how do we make sure that we're spending our resources, you know, economic and political and otherwise, on getting to solutions and responses that are going to get us to where we need to go and are not going to become stranded infrastructure of 20 years later, rather than going around installing, say, solar freaking roadways everywhere, as one might say. So I guess particularly for you, you know, so what do you see are the biggest lessons from places like, say, Masdar and Abu Dhabi and some of these big projects that you've worked on in Asia, where they have kind of had a blank slate to work from? What are the big lessons that you've seen from how those projects have worked out?
Yeah. Well, one advantage they have in Asia, particularly in economies like China, is that the government is able to sort of control the approach to the social sector, the economic sector, the industrial sector, and the technological sector all at once. The rest of the world doesn't really have that ability, and fortunately or unfortunately, but on a planning perspective, it's very effective. And so, you know, for instance, David Fridley and I, through Lawrence Berkeley Labs, worked on indicators for the largest 663 cities of China, and they had nothing on internet access. And, you know, that was just a big oversight. And I think that, you know, now you need to have internet for every home, every person to really be equitable with others, not only for jobs, but for many other purposes. So, you know, there are so many lessons. The Middle East, Masdar, I think, was a little early, and you know, they changed their goals and their vision. But I think one lodestar that we look to is a price on carbon, an international price on carbon. And that's not only for renewable energy, but that's for materials. And that, you know, really goes back to a lot of Alicia was talking about with building materials as being, you know, the great unspoken detriment to a lot of what's going on in our world right now, with architecture, design, maintaining cities and infrastructure. There's no handle on that really, and it's just beginning to emerge. But if there is an international price on carbon, you can bet that will cascade into every product category and into transportation of those products. I mean, if Walmart can track everything in their store and everything in their inventory through, you know, radio frequency ID tags, and they've been doing it for 10 years or so, you can bet that all the materials in buildings and in the development and planning and construction of our cities can be tracked more efficiently, and therefore we can then have a handle on how to plan our programs and our progress around those areas. So I think that's a big missing piece of the whole renewable energy paradigm right now, is that we're not looking at embodied energy of materials and our processes. And I think that will direct us better in terms of what we can do next and how we could prioritize which projects and our approaches. So I don't know if I answered your question. It's a big one. So
It is a big one, and there's a lot to chew on in there.
Yeah.
But this next, and actually, Hillary, do we have you back?
Yeah, you do. And I just thought
Great.
I'd weigh in on this embodied energy question, if that's
Please.
appropriate, because I think this is a complicated issue. And I guess one of the things that I feel that we can't do is abandon wholesale our levels of investment in both capital investment and human capital in our legacy infrastructure. We have to keep that in place. We have to adapt it, enhance it while we build out all sorts of distributed centers, satellite centers, because that is embodied energy, which is so substantive that we can't afford to just sort of abandon it. So that's why I do advocate for these interconnections, because they do allow us, in effect, to build on what we've already got in place.
I think that's really important, this embodied carbon. It's a specific input for us within the challenge. And a new program that we launched last year is the Living Product Challenge. And it's really bringing together visionary manufacturers, designers, and built environment professionals to reimagine the products that we use in the built environment. I think particularly around the Living Building Challenge, we're known for, I think, highlighting toxicity issues, but also this issue of embodying carbon. And I want to be very clear, while the standard can be used as a certification system, it applies to new construction as well as renovation. We have certified projects that are renovation and have taken into account that full life cycle issues and embodied carbon. And that's a really important part. We're not talking about going into our existing neighborhoods and transforming them into something completely new. It's about building upon what's already there and realizing those resources that we already have and enhancing them.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, 10 minutes if you all can stick around extra to make up for the time we took getting started, which was partly my fault. I apologize for that. So maybe as a way of starting to get some closing comments, and again, I really appreciate everyone's comments there in the chat transcript. We're trying to get some, and we will try to get, we are going to post this webinar on our website so you can watch the whole thing if you missed any part of it, or if your sound or video cut out at some point. I'll also do what I can to address some of these questions that we weren't able to get to. But maybe as some parting thoughts, at least for now, I guess I'll just pose to each of you. I'd love to hear what you think. So looking out, say, over the next 50 years, imagine that in that 50-year time frame, we're looking at a phasing out of coal, certainly. And I should mention, it is kind of our assumption in the book that part of what is the main things that are pushing this transition to renewable energy are kind of voluntary shifts away from fossil fuels for the purpose of mitigating climate change on the one hand, but on the other hand, the rather inevitable depletion of cheap fossil fuel resources. The idea being that we're going to be moving away from fossil fuels whether we want to or not. Again, whether it's because we choose to shut down all the coal plants or because we simply can't afford to run modern industrial society off of the very extreme energy resources of, say, fracked oil and gas, deep water oil, and all these other things that we tend to talk about at Post-Carbon Institute. So if imagine 50 years from now, if we're not at 100% renewable energy, we're getting very, very close. So the world is largely electric, but we've got some mixture of biofuels. Hopefully technology has figured some things like the battery tech challenge out. But it's not perfect. We're not in the Jetsons world at that point. So looking at that scale of time, what would you say is kind of the hardest nut to crack in the area that you're working on? Again, Hillary, that would be public works and infrastructure. Alicia, that would be I would say buildings and communities. And Warren, for you, I guess I would say that would be kind of communities and at this much larger scale, interacting with outlying industrial areas and even the megacity regions. So Hillary, let's go with you first again in case you drop out.
Okay, well, yeah, I think this is a really important question, and I think, some of the things we have to look at longer term are really beginning to stare us in the face with respect to climate change, sea level rise, and meteorological effects inland from increased heat and drought and so on and so forth. So I think that those are probably questions we need to start focusing on. I noticed one of the questions really asked, what coastal communities can do that's more renewable. And again, to stress the theme about the interactive nature of public works and the cross-linking. What they're starting to do in Holland, which has, of course, been really at the forefront of this mitigation plus adaptation equation, looking for the sweet spot, they're retrofitting some of their barrages, their tidal barriers, now with turbines in the barriers so that they're able to utilize that existing structure to also generate energy, tidal energy. So we're going to have to harness tidal energy. That's probably one area that is farther out, but it's obviously going to be essential because most of our urbanizing cities are on the coast, and so we're going to really be faced with that double challenge of having to mitigate and adapt at the same time.
Definitely.
Selection of nuts to crack.
Mitigating and adapting at the same time. I think Warren brought up earlier about some lack of adaptation planning there. The hardest nut to crack, the biggest barrier, honestly, it's ourselves. We need to get out of our own way. It's human inertia, status quo. And having catalytic projects and examples, I think Hillary's work, Warren's work of showing the examples, the bright spots out there, the living buildings in the world that can really inspire people that this is possible. We can do this. I find it interesting that, I never took any human behavior courses when I was becoming an architect in school. Perhaps we all need some of those. And certainly we need better allies in multidisciplinary teams. And I'm not talking about architects and engineers communicating better between each other. I'm talking about biologists as part of our team and human behavioralists as part of our team. And we need to work more in an interrelated fashion because we can no longer afford infrastructure that only serves one purpose. Whether that be maximizing the efficiency and safety for one group of single occupant vehicles at the expense of others, or any of our other interrelated infrastructure like water and energy, particularly in California as it's being pumped over the Tehachapi's, as Warren was noting earlier. I think policy and political will is another aspect. And so this is definitely, I think, grassroots, ground up, and top down, like in the China example Warren was talking about. So we have some work, for example, the First Hill neighborhood in Seattle, another neighborhood, Mount Baker, is working on these issues and saying this is important to our community. We want to be looking at the Living Community Challenge and taking that to city electeds and saying this is a priority to us. It should be a priority for our electeds. And I think those are some. The technical parts, we've got those off-the-shelf technology in many cases, particularly for living buildings. We just need to put all the pieces together now.
That's an important observation. I'm glad you mentioned that at the very end, that we do have the technology that we need. We do actually tend to agree with that at Post-Carbon, but also with the caveat that while we have the technology that we need, scaling it up to meet the current levels of energy consumption is a whole other matter, which is why conservation and efficiency, which are two separate things, are so important to focus on. So Warren, how about you? What do you feel are the toughest nuts to crack?
Yeah. So you mentioned technology, and as good as technology can be and helpful to address all these problems, I think people are getting more and more focused on technology to the extent of nature and natural systems that support us in our economy and provide for our extravagant lifestyles. And, you know, especially if we're privileged, like some of us are. So I think it's really, we have to understand natural systems, how they're performing, how they're healing. And Alicia's mention of the restorative economy is really just an essential at the core of really, you know, bringing a 100% renewable economy to true to its peak, really. And the peak of our civilization is going to be looking at nature, understanding the signals from nature. Right now, many of them headed in the wrong direction, but we have gone in the positive direction for the Montreal Protocol, for CFCs, for air quality in many American cities, for water quality. You know, during some of our lifetimes, Cuyahoga River was burning, and some lakes that were unswimmable or unusable are now much better. On the other hand, climate change is forcing some major signs like eutrophication, and blue-green algae now is breaking out all over the United States, in China, in California, San Francisco Bay, Florida, Lake Utah just this week. You know, so these are major signs that we need to do things differently. And I think if we link our economic systems and our social systems, including education and the way we build our communities and our homes, our businesses, to reflect on a feedback loop for the health of the natural systems, then we'll be moving in the right direction. And that includes megacities, you know, and their use of water and energy and materials, and the way they grow food, and the way people live and well-being. So that's my 2 cents in that.
Great, thank you, Warren. It's striking to me. It's actually a little bit funny to me, and I'm kind of enjoying the connection about how here we are in 2016 after, you know, what is this, 24 years, 25 years practically after the Rio Earth Summit, Local Agenda 21, kind of the beginnings of taking urban sustainability seriously again in the United States. And we've gone through so many different phases, like I mentioned before, with the different metrics and the different standards, and LEED and whatnot, and new urbanism and different focuses and different kinds of technology. And it comes to now where some of the most radical ideas have to do with things like biomimicry and ecological design and restorative urban environments, and kind of these ideas that in some ways have their roots in the 60s and the 70s, thinking in this much more systems pattern of how we address our challenges, as opposed to just finding the tech solutions, which I think was the direction that a lot of us thought things were going, say, back in the 90s. So it's come full circle in a very interesting way, and I'm appreciating that. So that's it for time. Again, thank you so much to our 3 presenters, Warren Karlenzig, who was just speaking, of Common Current, Hillary Brown of City College of New York, author. I gotta plug people's books. Where's Hillary's book? Oh, I can't find it. Hillary's the author of Next Generation Infrastructure from Island Press, which also just released our book here at Post Carbon Institute, Our Renewable Future. We also have Alicia Daniels Uhlig from the International Living Future Institute and the Living Communities Challenge Program. Thank you all so much for participating in this webinar. Again, we'll have the webinar video posted on our website in a few days. Thank you to our presenters, and please join us for the next webinar, which you can find information for that online. Thanks, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.